Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So today we're going to talk about sort of the political and communication hurdles that we are facing in this newer age. Um, and a lot of this panel will focus on what are the risks that we have now that might be different than before, and how do we mitigate those risks. So hopefully we walk away with some actionable ideas and some good follow-up discussions. Um, so I'd like to kick it off with a general question for the panel, for everybody, so we can sort of go, I guess, in right to left order here. Um, what are the biggest new risks that you're seeing in this space? Go ahead, yeah. Oh,
Oh, is it on? Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. I was thinking about, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I was thinking about this in two perspectives. Number one is Gallup as an organization, there's a lot of different data that we collect just based on opinions of not just Americans, but globally. We cover about 98% of the world with our world poll. So I want to share some data based on what we're finding there. Number two, also more from an organization standpoint, as we think about some of the work that we do, a lot of it comes from the people in our organization. So how do we get them ready for the new risk? What kind of training? What does AI mean in their daily jobs? So those are kind of the two perspectives that I thought about. Maybe I just set the ground here by saying, so we've measured trust in news, we've tracked it for decades. And today, if you were to ask me, well, what's the latest poll shows? It says 30%, 31% of Americans, they don't really have full confidence in the media. Now, if you want to compare that to about 4 or 5 decades ago, that number was in the high 60s and 70s. And then if you break that down, there's difference in generations, obviously in your political parties, too. There's a lot of different cuts that we can look into. But what we're really facing, in my opinion, is no matter how much good media or good information we pump out, let's just say, what people are really feeling about it, how they're actually absorbing it and trusting it. I think that's really the risk that keeps growing and growing. And now with AI and how real things can get with deep fakes, all these different kinds of things that we're seeing out there, I think it's only going to get worse.
thanks.
I'm not exactly going to give anybody some optimism after that. However, I do think that we're seeing a couple of dynamics that I think really do matter. So the first is just the proliferation of platforms, ways that people get information. I don't even want to call it the news anymore because we've increasingly seen people move away from editorial to more, or excuse me, move away from journalistic standards of what has been reviewed and printed in mainstream media to a more editorial eye for how people consider mixing news and opinion. So the number of ways that people can get their information means that we're all living in not just these algorithmic silos, which we've talked about over and over again in Section 230 and all of these different things. But the proliferation of platforms means that people are not just living in silos, but they're living in silos and spaces that are already catering to their ideological preferences. I think that what that means is that we're not even seeing the same information anymore. And that is both in terms of what people are seeing and not seeing, but the way that it's being portrayed. And it's really hard, especially to bring it back to what does this mean for corporations. Most corporations, unless you're Act Blue or Win Red here in the United States, are trying to be purple. And they're trying to make sure that they remain trusted by their customers, regardless of their political affiliations, regardless of their race, gender, orientation, etc. And that's just becoming increasingly challenging because different groups on platforms are essentially manipulating brands to further their goals. And oftentimes brands have no idea. So we've had to invest pretty heavily in order to continue supporting organizations we work with in proprietary data collection and actually going out and making sure that we have eyes on in terms of what's happening out there. And then I think the next piece is then what do you do about it? And I don't mean this in a political way, but just to paint a picture, What do you do if you are Harvard and you are being told that you have to teach or not teach certain things that may go against your core principles? There's also a reality that you are an employer and you have an obligation to your people to keep the lights on. And so I think what we're seeing is that organizations are increasingly put to the test in terms of what are your core values and where are you willing to stand up, and are under pressure to act quickly, and having the insight of what's actually out there online so that you know where your customers, your partners, your shareholders, and frankly, your employees. I think people forget about the teams that actually work there in these high stress, high pressure moments where they are on these issues so that you can appropriately navigate this situation together as not just your company, but as your community.
Thanks, Mitchell.
Yes, let's see, you asked for new risks, and
Yeah.
so I'm going to have two threads that aren't, and one is the degree to which the technology is just leapfrogging the human ability to engage with it, understand it. And so we're in, hopefully it's a transition period, but I think it's going to be highly disruptive socially. Both the idea that, there's a million platforms and people may be messing with your corporate brand and you don't even know it, but but even for individuals, how do we get information? Who do we trust? Why do we trust something? Where is it? And right now, the new risk, I think, is that that's so merged in with divisive politics. And coming out of social media straight into AI, the ability to manipulate people's minds into addiction and outrage and divisiveness and quick reactions. Like, we've been tuned for 10, 20 years now to, like and get outraged and not do anything more. And so that's a fertile ground for the additional powers of AI, or the power of AI to make all that information seem more real, whether it is or not, and to divide us. And so the issues, I think, are that just as an individual human being, like, we're just outclassed right now, and we don't have institutions, we don't have the experience to understand. When radio and TV came in the 30s, there were massive social changes and global events that followed that. I don't think it's a coincidence. So this question of, can we figure this out? Can we figure out information? Can we figure out leadership? Can we figure out, as societies, I've seen this thing on this platform, it's really hateful, and it says person X or brand X or whatever did this amazingly awful thing. Probably not true. How would I verify it? Like, to be able to monitor our own outrage or response in ways, that are going to be new in response to these technologies. And so all of that kind of rolls up right now.
Thank you all. So we talked a little bit here about what the new risks might be. And you brought a great point up, and so maybe we'll go the opposite way here. There's a piece around we're always going to have new risks, and you brought this up with technology changing, but there's also a really big piece here on the acceleration of it. And so another question I'd like for us to think about is sort of, given the acceleration and given the leapfrog, and we might be a bit behind now, is there a way for us to run in tandem or catch up, or how do we deal with that kind of acceleration? And maybe start with Mitchell and we'll go the other way. That's okay.
Well, I spent my life at Mozilla, which is a nonprofit technology org, so this may sound odd, but I am a big believer in the power of the market to drive change. That's why a nonprofit tech org is to build something different. And so I do think that experience with the technology, with using it and with understanding it, is our friend. And in an interesting way, experience with this technology in work environments can be wildly powerful. Because usually in a work environment, you have some output. Usually it's revenue for the company, but that gets measured against. It's not just your own beliefs. It's how does the rest of society respond to your company? And so whether you've been fed or your training data is wrong and you get bad outputs and your business fails, you'll know that. And so that's, if I were going to summarize, I think it's a real familiarity with tools, with what they do, with what they don't do, and seeing them fail sometimes and understanding. And oddly, I think the workplace can drive a lot of those things.
I would agree with that. When I started the company, I actually thought about starting it as a nonprofit because we detect and mitigate online risks, and we started with disinformation. And the way our technology works is it's really about that early detection of where is something happening online across the open web that could create a risk, and who's behind it, how is it spreading, what type of risk is it, and what can you do about it. And I ultimately decided not to because I didn't have much faith in democracies to have a strong appetite for collecting social media data on its citizens, and didn't think that that was something that anybody would be comfortable with. And what we've increasingly found is, especially as the world goes through this period of deregulation, I kind of joke that I'm almost over the public private partnership because I don't think that much will really be done in this space in hyper deregulation. And I'm actually much more interested in the private private partnership of companies, especially global companies, want to be able to make sure that people have access to accurate information, are still upholding principles of making sure that the ideas of and the information that's out there is accurate, and have a vested interest in being able to deal with these types of risks. And so that's one path forward that we see in terms of how can organizations come together, because the way that some of these risks work, if they're not targeting your company one day, they're targeting another company the next day. And so I agree that that can be a potential avenue and path forward as we face a period of change, uncertainty, but also how we get these technologies into the that can actually help solve the problem into the hands of individuals.
I think quite a bit about when I first started using a cell phone and I stopped memorizing phone numbers. And I always joke saying at some point I outsourced my memory. Um, e- Ever since, let's say, since ChatGPT came out, and I'm sure all of us here have been really just, trying to get to know what it is, how it works. And I often notice we're starting to outsource thinking. A lot of the reasoning and all this, we almost depend on the, this AI to do this for me. I joke around sometimes with my colleagues. I say, at some point, I think it's just our chats talking and we're just the delivery people, right? We're just the messengers. I think that's a risk, and we have to consciously think about it's a very good thing that we can scale our thinking, but we have to treat it as a co-intelligence mechanism rather than just completely outsourcing it. And I see it a lot in our organization as we start rolling out from Copilot, ChatGPT. A lot of people are so amused by it, they're using it, but you could also tell a lot of the thinking was kind of outsourced, right? And you lose your own voice, your thinking, your opinion, and things. So I think you got to be careful with that. From an organization standpoint, I agree with you. We have to, whatever the foundational information is that the AI is giving you, there's no real detection right now for what's true and what's not, right? And I think that's a real danger part. It Ideally, we're in a world where we do have organizations that use it responsibly, but I mean, there's no way we can stop, others out there because it is open source. Anyone can create and plug in anything they want. There has to be a mechanism that balances it out. And if anything, there's got to be some form of knowing what is trusted information. Again, especially at Gallup, because we think a lot about the trust that we put into our data and our readers. What is that mechanism that we could really scale and say this is the information you can trust versus this is not an authenticated information? I think that's something like that.
Thank you. I would like to build on that a little bit with the next piece. So, if we have, perhaps misinformation, disinformation that's created by AIs, but you all touched on different ways on this another entity in the room, right? So we've got an AI that is working alongside humans as a co-pilot in an organization, is delivering information to them potentially, and sometimes that information is hallucinated. It's not from a ground truth. We have existing ways to mitigate this before, let's say before ChatGPT was prevalent in everyone's computer. What are the mitigation strategies you see not working going forward as we think about a third actor that's not a human, and one that has lots of information but maybe faulty?
An interesting experiment that we've been running through is we're in the business of data. We're also in the business of, let's just say, IP, a lot of content and things like that. Once ChatGPT came out, we realized it was already out there. There's no walling in, or it's already too late. So I don't think that's the right strategy. Again, we do have a lot of data, proprietary data and IP that's basically walled off, but I'm not sure if that's the future. I think it's really about balancing, again, going back to what is a credible source versus not. And if I look at different sides of our business and our organization, we have content, everything from well-being content to coaching to all these different things. It's at what point is it the right methodology that's used and authenticated, backed up by science versus wherever else the rest of the stuff is getting blended in. So walling off to me is not really the answer. It's got to be something else.
I agree. I mean, Pandora's box is open and it's not all bad, to be totally honest. I do think that as we just increasingly use AI, we just have to understand its limitations. And I think everybody in this room knows that AI is not magic, it's fancy math when you boil it down to its lowest common denominator. But one of the things that we've found is that this is like any technology revolution where if there's an error, fundamentally it's because a human programming it made an error. And we should expect that humans will make errors because humans are not perfect. Unfortunately, we should also expect that humans will do things that may not necessarily be as ethical as we would hope. And there's a need for AI security, the same way that there was a need for endpoint security once everybody was able to get a laptop, a cell phone, et cetera. And so I think that what we really need to do is understand that these are risks that we're going to live with and come up with ways to mitigate those risks and understand where our tolerance is. Because the same way that, you don't want to be surrounded by bodyguards to go to the grocery store if you're not currently under attack, that would be an insane risk mitigation plan for the average person. We don't need that for technology either, but we need to really understand, I think, what are the risks of AI, and there's a lot of great research being done on that now. And then what is reasonable and appropriate in terms of what risks can we live with and what risks can we not live with. So on our side, what that looks like, because our technology was automating a human service. We started as a services company and bootstrap for the first about 2 years. We decided that there would be we would never fully automate the question of who is behind a narrative and that attribution, because if you are wrong, it's fatal. And so figuring out what can be fully automated versus what should always be supervised, I think is also a question that companies should be thinking about, but individuals should be thinking about as well as they begin to adopt technology for personal use.
I'm going to step back to your question, I think, about why do mitigations not work, or why haven't they worked, or what's different. And I'd say there's two categories: the ones that we are similar to the past, of which security is one, and your analogy is awesome, right? Like there's some level of security versus convenience that we all make. And so there's some of those that are known, but I think there's another reason that mitigations, we're a couple of years into even generative AI, and the mitigations discussion is really, really early, is this impact on human perception. Like for many of us, like the first reaction to generative AI was, ChatGPT. Like, it feels human. And so people anthropomorphize. Always stumble on that word. And that's a little bit different than other technologies. And it's different than, like typing, or trying to thumb with something. So it feels and seems human. It's engaging with human language. And so those things, for the average person are really different. Like a scientist folding proteins knows exactly what's happening. Like it's not like you're talking to a human and, falling in love with them as people do. Like this is a mathematical tool that's helping you do things. But at the general consumer level, when you're engaging with something, like, it feels different. And so the mitigations that we're accustomed to are more maybe mechanical or more attuned to the era when software or internet services are distinctly, on the screen or in the box. And so I think I'm back to my first point, which is that some of the mitigation is a perceptual issue of how human beings understand this technology and engage with it. And we're just really early with that. And the social sciences are catching up. And the social sciences goes back to another problem, like even getting access to the data to understand what's happening requires, negotiating with the big 5 or 10 or whatever, our facilities for research and anthropologists and social sciences to understand these new technologies and be able to actually do serious level research on what's happening in the brain as you engage with them, and all of those things is, rudimentary, and we need all of those things for like a full toolkit of mitigations.
That's wonderful. So I'd like to ask everybody, each of the panelists rather, some specific questions, and then everyone else can jump in. And the first one I have is actually for you, Mitchell, so maybe we'll go back this way again. And when you think about the open weight models, right? So there's all of these models have come out to do this AI work, and some of them are open and some of them are closed. And OpenAI recently announced that they're going to produce an open weight model, and there's been this big debate in the space over with this new tool that is maybe we can't really reason about as well, and it's moving really quickly. There are benefits in having the openness, but there's also downfalls. There are pitfalls or downsides to that, where if people get a hold of something and they can manipulate it in a way, they could cause harm. So I was wondering your thoughts on this sort of open versus closed debate in the models specifically.
Okay, I'll start at the high level and kind of get more specific. In my view, in the long term, open must win. No question about it. We'll want to talk a little bit about what open means. Can't be exactly what open source software is because of models and weights and data. And of course, a little bit about what win means. My product Firefox, for example, was credited with changing the internet. It never had more than 30% market share, and began to drive change at 10%. So for us, that's a win. But open must win. Why? And I'll point to some of the work that Mustafa Suleyman describes, which is very exciting, and that's really outsourcing some of your memory functions. But his vision of the world, and they've just released some new things on this, is that your personal AI is with you all the time. It sees everything you see. It hears everything you hear. It's a part of every conversation that you have, and it remembers all of that. And so in his the exciting part of his description is, you're thinking to yourself, oh, I had this great idea last week. What was it? You can just ask. Or, oh, so-and-so and I had this wonderful conversation and it was going in these ways. What was that again? And didn't I want to talk to someone? And all of that creativity that gets lost with memory is available to you. So that's awesome, right? Like, that's awesome. But the thing is, that's a deep level of interaction with my brain. Like, memory is part of our brain, the way we store things in the human brain is pretty odd. And so you're providing input so deep into your thinking, it's awesome to have it, but no one business can own that. Like, Microsoft cannot tune how I engage with my memory. Right, that is a bad solution, whether it's Microsoft or the big 5 or the 5 from China or someone who comes out of, the UAE, wherever. Like, no one business should be able to have that kind of deep impact on my own thinking processes in a way that I don't know, don't understand, need to buy somehow, and that the value to me has to compete with the value to shareholders. Like, lots of people might want that. Maybe it's free, maybe it's easy, maybe it's convenient, maybe it has good interoperability with your watch and your phone, like, great. But open must win. There must be an alternative that's open, that I or the smarter people than me, can understand what's happening, that can be interrogated, that can be tuned, that I can know that the memory storage is both accurate, that if I was angry when I heard it, it doesn't always come back to me, in an outrage mode, that like some way to engage with all of the elements of my thinking. And so that can't be any one or handful of companies, or we're in bad shape if that's true. So open must win. Then historically, there have been a lot of comments about open. And I'll say when open source appeared, it was so weird, and it was just these weird developers, software developers, and the idea of open and sharing, at least in the Western world, didn't exist. We didn't have Airbnb or sharing cars, any of that. Like, you only did things when you got paid, and you never shared them, right? And so the businesses of the time underestimated the power of open, right? And it wasn't until the internet, Microsoft lost control of the internet through open source, Firefox, that the power became apparent. Only this time around, the powers that be understand the power of open very well. And so some of the things that we've heard, excuse me, I think are just made up. They're things we heard before, security vulnerability, whatever it is, right? And so as you work your way through those, they usually end up with two things. And one of them is, okay, well, I can't really exactly say how yet, but I'm pretty sure that if something really bad happens, like a weapon is created, a biological weapon, it'll be out of an open source program. Like, that's one. Maybe. Nobody actually denies you can do it in closed source programs, or that the information isn't really there in Google search already. It's just easier. So that is one that you have to pay attention to. I will say in private circles, I hear less of that now than like 2 years ago when it came out. And then the other one is always about China. At least in the US, is always about China. That if we're open, that helps China, and the US has to win. And then I think it was Eric Schmidt after DeepSeek came out and was so surprising. Well, U.S. open must win. So there's a lot of geopolitical things in there as well. And so just to close, I'll say this argument that's different from the past, that something really scary like a biological weapon could be made more easily in an open source one. I think that needs a little more research. If it's true, you want to pay attention to it, right? You give that some weight if you found it was true. But we haven't yet, and that research and that understanding isn't there, so you have to think about that a little bit. And then, of course, the geopolitics comes into things, and business comes into things a lot.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to follow up or comment on the open versus closed piece?
Maybe I'll just an observation I've been having is, I think the speed of adoption right now is just all over the place, right? And just in my own household, I can identify who's basically on ChatGPT all day versus who could care less. Now, you spread that out as a society or even in organizations to all of a sudden, I think we're having a lot of difference in terms of how we think, the speed of thinking, scaling, and all these different things. Again, maybe it will level out at some point, just like I'm sure when the internet first came out, not everyone got on there and everyone understood how to use it. But I feel like because of the way, once OpenAI, I think, unleashed some of this to the public, I think the speed of adoption has created vast differences in terms of groups that have just been the early adopters, going right in, versus those who are not. But you can also see that in organizations. So even with some of the work that we do, we have our own AI and all this stuff. We have clients who say we don't want any of that in our organization, like, period. So I'm seeing a lot of variance in terms of the speed of adoption. I'm just wondering what that means for the future, or the near future, I guess.
Do you want to follow up, or do you want to move on?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that long term there will be a need to open source, and I think it will happen organically, whether people want it to or not. It's just how it's always gone. And you look at any time that there's been control over some sort of technological advancement in history, it starts obviously with private capital, and then it really does always become open and readily available. And that's true of, I think, every advancement. And I think it's something that we should embrace. I think it gives people more choice. I think that what we're also talking about, though, is the balance of responsibility between the technology company and the user. I think, in particular, in light of the fact that as regulation tends to be decreasing, at least here in the United States, probably not as much in Europe still, there's a need, I think, that we're also need to and I don't want to be one of those people who's like, if we teach it in school, that will solve all of our problems, because that doesn't work either. But there is a need to be able to teach people what the limitations are, how to use these models effectively, and also educate in terms of what both the input and the output means. Um, because outside of really, I would say, the corporate level of like understanding what it means when Google changes its search algorithms to be more reliant upon Reddit data to then spit back at you what it is that you're asking as a question, there isn't necessarily that broad awareness. So this is actually an area where I think transparency is really important. And even the free speech absolutists, I think, are okay with adding more transparency to how information is being curated, how information is being engaged with. And I think we'd be hard pressed to find anybody, at least on this panel, it sounds like, vehemently opposed to open sourcing most of the technology advancements.
Thank you. And Lisa, the next one is for you as we go through. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about perception and bring some of the politics into this conversation. So the perception.
Let's do it.
I figured you'd be game. So the perception of the U.S. right now, and I'll let you like extrapolate that from there. But how do you think about how people can use AI as a way to either keep track of that perception, how it might be affecting them, or how do they think about changing their own, how the way these corporations really are perceived given the political environment in the US?
Yeah, so I'll pick on tariffs because it's what's top of mind for me right now, and just something that we've been supporting a lot of people through. We're getting a little bit into the world according to Lisa, but it appears that right now, and again, not a political statement, but there appears to be two separate trade wars going on. There's one where it's the US versus China, and there's the one where it's the US versus everybody else. And so I think what we're seeing is a couple of things. We are seeing that domestically in the United States, in a lot of the right-leaning communities and platforms, that people are excited about what's happening, that it's a lot of buckle down. This is going to be worth it in the long run. I really hope that everybody knows what they're doing. I don't like what's happening in this moment, but I'm in it for the long haul. This is the change that we need. On the left, we're seeing a lot of more organized calls for investigations and inquiries and things that Congress can't do right now because the left is not in control of Congress. And so we are seeing a lot of calls for activism, a lot of do whatever you can to stop this. Internationally, I think we're seeing a serious rise in anti-Americanism. And I think that's been a serious challenge for companies who, again, are not trying to be red or blue, or they probably would say that they are globalists, though, in terms of wanting to serve global markets. And when we are talking to companies, what we are increasingly seeing, without naming specifics, is they want to be global partners. They want to make sure that they're able to support global markets. And they're put in between a rock and a hard place because they're also afraid sometimes to speak out because they're afraid of potential regulatory retaliation. And so what we are seeing in terms of perceptions right now, and what our technology is showing us, and how I think companies can really chart the path forward in terms of these perceptions, is obviously the way that the algorithms work has to do with monetization and influencers, et cetera. And companies want a stable economy and future. And they have invested incredible amounts of money into their brand recognition, into their ability to access influencer networks, particularly as we've heard today, for example, with the decrease in trust in media and the proliferation of platforms. It's becoming increasingly important that it's not just the right message, but the right messenger, and told in their words. And so the AI that we use to essentially develop the insight of who is influential and how can companies achieve their goal of being able to reach people and make sure that at least their story is heard, really has to do with transparency. especially with the backdrop of inflation and companies being accused of price gouging. We find that the more honest and transparent companies are in this moment, the harder it is to manipulate and to make sure that people are hearing from you because they already trust you is critical, but also being able to make sure that those who are kind of on your team are also aware of your message, partnering where you can through trade associations too.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to do any follow up there? You're good, Mitchell? You're good. Okay. All right. So the next one is for you to take. I'm thinking about you in a couple of different ways. One is, Gallup is an organization that's providing really important data that is trusted and verified to organizations in this time where we have all of this possible mistrust in it. And the other is in sort of caring for your own business, right? And for looking at how your communications are affecting your business, but really in this very, I think, an interestingly positioned place as a business who is in the business of all of this. And so the question is, what are the particular risks given that framing that you're thinking through in these two different senses?
So we get our data and insights annually. We get cited about 200 to 300,000 times a year by major media publications. So the amount of, I guess, authenticity and reliability in terms of our data and what we're producing, that's something that's basically the lifeline of our company, right? So we're thinking about this all the time, but I also think the data that we extract, right? So we're looking at public opinions, perceptions. There's a lot there, a lot of optimism that we could really lean into, in my opinion. So I mentioned, I started with kind of a grim data on 31% of Americans don't trust the media and all this, but at the same time, 81% will say media is critical or important to success of democracy. Okay. So then if we're talking about the different platforms, so it's just a matter of, I don't think we've really hit, and maybe it's not just one source, but we just haven't hit the right sense. And it could be a generational thing. It could be, whatever the data cuts are. We have to figure out really how to get into the minds and the souls of people and how to deliver these we do have good data. I mean, that's the truth. But we just have to be able to get it to them directly without any distortions along the way. And I think that's something that, personally I'm always thinking about, but also we're thinking about how do we get to use these different sources to get there. I don't think we found the answer yet because the data gets worse and worse, trust the media. Having said that, there is hope because citizens do believe it's important. It's something that, it's just they haven't found something that they can really trust yet.
And that was a very particular question for you, so not something that the two can really answer. But if I think about you then as providing this data and providing this trusted data, and I think in some ways of Lisa and Mitchell as having worked in these spaces that deliver this information, right? Whether it be through access to this information on the internet, or whether it be through delivering this information to organizations, and how do they get to that? What are the pieces that I guess we'll go Lisa and then Mitchell. What are the pieces that you're seeing around the dissemination of this information, if it is trusted? So say we can start from a place where we're, fairly certain that it is truthful information. Maybe it comes from a trusted source like Gallup or a trusted news source. What are your thoughts on how we can disseminate that with the trust that we need?
So I want to acknowledge that we are in a world where we no longer teach full books in school because people can't pay attention which blew my mind when I learned that. Because I think that we do a really good job of coming up with accurate information, and it's not as fun and spicy as a 6-second TikTok that's a total lie. And so there's a question of, and I think it's a really important point that you're making around people. It was 81% of people that think that media is needed for a trusted democracy. I'd be curious to know what % of Americans still believe in or want a democracy as well. And so that is something that I think about at 3 a.m., by the way. If anybody else thinks about it at 3 a.m., find me later. But I think it's really important that we do think about dissemination and that we meet people where we are. So we have all of this great information. We have all of these prolific op-eds written in top tier media outlets. I would really love to know, because I'm not pop culture relevant at all. I suggested that we do something related to Friends, and my Gen Zs looked at me and said, okay, boomer. How is it that we are able to reach people based on their preferences? How is it that we get accurate information to people who are influential to their communities to be part of that message chain of what actually people are hearing and seeing? And that, I think, is a tough nut to crack, just because it's not just open source on social platforms, it's peer to peer, it's what's happening in your communities. And sometimes the best way to do that is to go analog and show up in person at events and talk to people through real relationships. So there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. Otherwise, we would have solved for this by now. But those are a couple of things that we see actually working.
Well, oddly, once again, I'm going to go back to the market. Both in the panel that was in here right before lunch and in general, when companies are trying to build products or startups are trying to tune product market fit, the question is, who's the audience and what do they need? And so I think that is the same question. Like we have, as you said, there's lots of editorials and some set of media that only a small slice of people look at. Like what's actually going on, and what are the problems that you'd say the target, the audience, the general population in country X, like what do they want and what are they looking for and what do they need? And that's the context in which information is received. And it may well be that the people writing the editorials, have had one life that's really leads itself to, a set of beliefs, but isn't relevant. And so it's really, what is the product market fit for the thing that, we might hold dear, and what's the delivery fit? You said, I think earlier, it's not just the message, it's the messenger. And so, like, what are people trying to solve in their own lives, and how is the message you want to deliver relevant to that?
Can I actually just add one more thing? I think that also raises a really important point of what's actually the goal of the message. And so when I think about just some of the outsized influence of these influencers, and I'll just give a couple of examples that have happened recently. Laura Loomer, who is an influencer in the United States to certain communities, had a meeting with the President of the United States, and then after that meeting, NSA leadership was fired. There's an account called Food Babe that is incredibly, I would say, arguably more important to certain individuals now deciding what ingredients are going to be permitted to be in certain food products in the United States. That's probably more influential to the policy conversation than most academic researchers. And so I am of the belief, because at our company we don't really do policy work, but it's more, if these are the rules of the game, how do you play the game? And so I just wanted to, because I completely agree with what you were saying, but provide a couple of examples that are very real that have happened recently in terms of what the messenger and message means, especially given the goal in the regulatory space right now.
Thank you. I have many more questions. We will not get to them. It is time for our Q&A. We're going to try to group a couple of questions together, I think, but we have a small enough audience. Maybe we can get through that. We have about 15 minutes.
Hi. I want to ask a question of the input or the role of the content moderation that we haven't touched, but especially with the capitalism, content moderation is very costly, and it's like easier not to do it, but it has certain roles, and how do you view it? And to build on that. Sometimes it's very hard to know what is true and what is not true. People believe in different truths, and in that mix, I mean, how do you do it right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. In the age of fake news, AI, and disinformation, would you advise business leaders to be on social media? And what would you, if yes, what would you advise to those business leaders who are on social media, and what should I do?
Well, maybe I'll start and others can build. I would only be on social media, I mean, as a business leader, about something I could be authentic about. Right? And so that's going to vary, because I think if you're not authentic, you're pretty much dead, right? Either you're ignored, like if you can tell when someone's social media content has been written by the corporate communications department and it's designed to be as bland as possible. It's like the Chat GPT. Well, there's two sides to everything, and so I would have a very minimal presence at that. I wouldn't, because once people are going to just roll their eyes at it, but they know you're there. So if that's your goal, you can kind of be there. But if you try to do anything else and you're not authentic about it, then I think you're dead. Like then you're really meat for people picking up on it, being angry at you, creating memes that you don't want, creating the seed of truth that can be at the root of a lot of fake information that's built across it. So I would aim for authenticity, even if it's a very thin social media presence.
I'll start with the content moderation question. And so just full disclosure, we don't work with social media platforms. It's not their business model. It's not our business model. We do view them as part of the solution if the terms of service are being broken. And so when we think about the terms of service, it's kind of like the laws of the platforms. So the change with some of content moderation, in my perspective on how some of this evolved, is after the 2016 elections when Russia launched an influence operation to target United States elections. All the heads of social media started getting hauled in front of Congress. And this was one way, that investment into trust and safety, into product safety, which interestingly was never actually part of the product organization. It typically fell under the CISO, which means that they were never really building like safe products by design, but rather accepting that disinformation and misinformation is more of a product vulnerability to clean up, not to be a total like organizational nerd about it. But the content moderation teams were an investment, and then interest rates go up back in, I guess it was 22. And all of a sudden, when government affairs bills never went down because people getting hauled in front of Congress or in front of the EU, well, it wasn't a good investment, so let's cut it. Let's replace what we can with AI. And let's maybe get rid of some of the content moderation, which was always outsourced to a third party anyways. There were some efforts to build models to be able to identify toxicity on platform and have that impact algorithms. But when we talk about content moderation versus community notes, I look at it as you're trading one bad system for one bad system and okay, whatever. Because the reality is if a post is going to gain traction, it typically happens within the first 2 hours of being posted. So you don't even have time to realize that it's out there and fact check it anyways. And the adding of a community note like makes corporate leadership feel like they accomplished something. But it's not like the platforms are alerting people to say, wait, that thing you saw, because we know that you saw it, you're part of the view count. That is actually not true. So there's never the follow-up piece. So I actually don't find it an effective strategy at all. So not to sound like a total pessimist about the platforms, but I just think it's part of the reality of the internet at this point, unfortunately. So what we do see effective, though, is working with media, putting things out on your own social media platforms, if appropriate, working with third parties, et cetera, because adding more context to narratives does work. That's another thing that we see as well. In terms of should corporate leaders be on social media, I'm kind of the belief that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so everybody should be on there. How often you post, I completely agree. It always needs to be authentic. People can smell inauthenticity a mile away. So it's not that you necessarily have to have pressure to post, but I do think everybody should be the equivalent of domain squatters on each of the platforms, regardless of whether or not you actually intend to use the account, because otherwise somebody has the opportunity to impersonate you. So, and it's much easier if an impersonation account pops up to get it taken down if you can point to one and say, this is, you know, the real whoever it is. It gets actioned a lot faster. So that's my recommendation.
I think from a social media standpoint, I personally am probably more on the menu than
That's okay.
than at the table.
We'll keep that in mind when we start posting about you.
Having said that, I think if you are active on it, I always say, why, don't leave an open door for anything to just stir things up unnecessarily, right? So again, every company is very different, their value systems and their audience, to all that. Make sure it's aligned with your company, and I would just keep it as simple as that. In terms of your question, I think I have a bit of a different angle on it, because our founder, George Gallup, decades ago, said the biggest threat to America is that we have a society that prefers to be entertained than informed. So if you think about, again, he said this before even the internet came out, right? So if you look at our society today, I go, wow, I guess he was onto something. But a lot of the content is driven to basically have you engage, have the audience engage and be entertained, right? That's kind of the main driver. So it's really hard, in my opinion, to moderate content based on that. I think we have perhaps a deeper, more profound, I don't know if it's an issue, but a shift in who we are as a society that needs to be addressed than just through media.
Do we have another? Do we have any more questions? And just as a reminder, we'll try to batch these together and try to say your question in 30 seconds.
What are the key factors in establishing and sustaining trust in the age of fake news, AI, and disinformation, from your point of view?
Do you have any other questions that are maybe related, or it doesn't have to be related? Go ahead. Yes.
It may not be related, but my question is this. What is an antidote to fake news, or having that discerning eye or mind, or in some cases heart? Could that go way back to the educational system, where I think you touched upon it? Anthropology matters, sociology matters. In other words, the liberal arts education matters, but start early, like in the elementary school. And with respect to information versus fake news, or entertainment versus accurate information, could it be that, we learn in science the hypothesis of the scientific method? Could it be possible that we learn this information method where we talk about journalistic standards and integrity at the educational level at elementary school to develop that discerning eye, heart, and mind? What are your thoughts on that?
So we've actually seen, I'll start with the education question. We have seen a lot of progress, especially in some of EU countries, in terms of teaching this in school. I found out I was a product of public school in the United States. I didn't realize this wasn't normal, but we actually did learn things like how to read for bias when it's a newspaper. So I do think that there is a corollary that can and should be taught around social media. There are some programs in the Netherlands that are fantastic, as well as Sweden. But my favorite anecdote that I've heard is that in the Netherlands, in kindergarten actually, you're taught to write fake news. And so why does it work? And they have a Facebook page where they will post these kindergartners writing fake news stories. And a kindergartner wrote that it was going to be 62 degrees Fahrenheit in January, whatever the Celsius version was. And about a third of the country saw it, and many people did not wear jackets, and they were very cold. And so it came up on the nightly news of the number of people who got fooled by a kindergartner when they commuted to work on their bicycles and were very cold. And so I think that is how we get out of this mess. You can only security your way out of so many situations. You also have to invest in resiliency, which gets to the next question of how do you build trust? Authenticity, being transparent where you can, And I think understanding what is and isn't expected of you to comment on. I think brands lose trust when they go outside of their lane. For example, and I also think that brands lose trust when they act in a way that's not in accordance with their core values. I'd be very curious, for example, to see trust in institutions in higher education right now with Columbia versus Harvard. Not to give you an idea for a poll that I'd be really interested in reading. But those are the kinds of things where both organizations have really invested in the idea of academic freedom and principles. But that's the sort of question that I think they've invested so much, and can one event actually lose that trust, or is there more, I would say, that they've invested in that they can tap into?
I think from my perspective, I don't know about an education or some way to teach our younger generations to spot things. I don't know much about that, but I do know companies like Gallup and others who have gained trust to a certain degree, it's crucial to keep it. And it's crucial to be, if this is a Gallup published data, that people do not think twice about it, right? And I always joke to my peers, when I was doing my dissertation, and if it wasn't peer reviewed, like don't even bother using it, right? Because it doesn't count. But there's got to be that source of place where people can go and know that it's trusted, and those companies who have established that already, they need to maintain that, and it'll be more and more important as we get into our next stage of AI to whatever's coming at us.
Yes, so there are some brands that are trusted, and so if the information is legitimately from that brand, you might trust it. I also think for those set of people who are really interested, it's the set of products that help you understand the provenance of information. Like trust is a very complicated thing. What does it actually mean? We could spend a lot of time on what trust means. But we certainly, as an industry, like AI and technology, can do a lot better on where did this information come from, or what was the training data, what are the problems with the training data, or assuming you don't even know that, like which AI system did it come from, what was the prompt. There's a range of things I think that can be done on to help a normal person be able to get further in understanding what's the source of this information. Or if it was someplace else, what can you learn about it? What kind of comments have been made about it? And I think, maybe those things will be a pain, like the old virus checkers that you had were kind of a pain, but after they got to be kind of understood well enough, you kind of set them and forgot them. They may need more interactive engagement from a person, like from you. And so I think in the beginning, it's the set of people who are really interested in understanding what is the source, should I believe it, do I want to believe it, who are the test cases or the early adopters in a product market discussion of what could be a technology, a consumer technology that was prevalent that might help the whole society be healthier. And on the education side, I'm a big believer in education, but I'm also a believer that so many people are trying to pay their bills, pay their mortgage, get their kids to school, think about a future, figure out, am I buying medicines or am I buying food? That we have to be very careful in thinking that like a deep understanding of these massive technology issues is the answer. So on the one hand, yes, for education, but on the other hand, there have to be other solutions as well, because some months, a priority in our household is making sure we understand like what are sustainably harvested fish that we're going to buy. But that's not going to be my lifetime goal, more important than understanding every other technology forever. Or if it is for me, it might not be for you. And I think we need to live in the reality that we also, along with education, need to make it easier and have more options to be more informed or smarter.
Thank you for that. And with that, I think we're out of time just about. So thank you all for coming. And thank you especially to the panelists. This is really great.